Her daughter-in-law smirked and said, "She's just waiting around to die." Margaret Langley passed the pie, folded her napkin, then erased them from her future. By sunrise, the house was sold, the trust rewritten, and the family left off the paperwork. No fight, no warning, just a door that wouldn't open anymore. They laughed at dessert while she finalized their eviction, and when they read her letter, the will had already spoken. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The gravy boat made its slow journey around the table, passed from hand to hand like a relic. The dining room flickered with candlelight and the soft glow of string bulbs Lacey had insisted on stringing for ambiance. Turkey, stuffing, 3 kinds of pie. It was a curated performance masquerading as Thanksgiving. Margaret sat at the head of the table, though only technically. The platters had been arranged without her input. The wine was Lacey's choice. And the centerpiece, an overstuffed cornucopia dripping faux leaves and metallic gourds, clashed against the lace runner Margaret's mother once embroidered by hand. Still, she smiled. "So," she began, folding her napkin onto her lap, "this reminds me of the year we had Thanksgiving during the blackout. We cooked half the dinner on the wood stove and—" A sharp sigh sliced through the room like a dropped knife. Lacey, seated across from her, exaggerated the eye roll so dramatically it almost looked choreographed. "Oh my God," she muttered to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's just waiting around to die, and narrating it in real time." A hush followed, just a beat too long. Then Alan chuckled, not a full laugh, just enough to clear the tension in favor of keeping things light. "Lace," he said, grinning into his wineglass. "Come on." But there was no real reprimand, no pushback. Margaret's hand twitched on the napkin in her lap. She looked down at her plate, turkey sliced too thick, green beans cooling on the edge, and chewed slowly. Swallowed. Nobody looked at her. The grandkids, Claire, 16 and fidgeting with her phone, and Tyler, 9 and already zoned out on pumpkin pie, barely blinked. No one noticed her sitting a little straighter in her chair. No one saw the color drain slightly from her cheeks. She took a sip of water and pressed the glass to her bottom lip. Lacey leaned back, smug in her skin-tight sweater and pointed lashes, and gave a brittle little laugh. "Oh, lighten up," she said to Alan. "Your mom's a tough cookie. She's told that same story 3 years in a row. I figured we'd all get a break before dessert." Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence filled the room like a fog bank. The clink of forks resumed. Someone mentioned football. Tyler asked for whipped cream. Lacey stood to refill the coffee pot, giving Margaret a cheerful smile that never reached her eyes. "Do you want decaf or just hot water?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Hot water's fine," she said. "For your tea?" Lacey called from the kitchen. "Or your knees?" More laughter. From Alan this time. Margaret watched the way her son covered his smirk behind his hand, the way he didn't look at her directly, like he couldn't. She stared at her hands, at the veins beneath her skin, at the napkin she'd twisted into a rope of quiet rage. When dessert was served, pecan pie from a box, despite the recipe Margaret had offered, Lacey leaned over the table, beaming at the grandkids, and said, "See? Grandma's got her slice. Everybody's happy now." She lifted her fork like a trophy. Margaret smiled back, small, brittle, unreadable, but her fingers, beneath the table, had stopped shaking. Later that night, Lacey would hum as she loaded the dishwasher. Alan would snore on the couch with his belt unbuckled and a football game still playing. The kids would drift off to sleep without ever sensing a shift. But upstairs, in the quiet, in the room still filled with the scent of cedar and memory, Margaret would sit at her old desk and unlock the drawer she hadn't opened in years. The house creaked as Margaret climbed the stairs, not from age but from memory. Every groan in the floorboards sounded like someone whispering what she already knew. "You don't belong here anymore." She moved quietly past the framed photos in the hallway, family vacations, smiling grandkids, her wedding portrait with Richard, when the world still felt like it could be navigated with kindness. She didn't pause. Not this time. Her bedroom door closed with a soft click behind her. She crossed to the cedar desk near the window, its grain darkened with time and use, its surface cleared of everything but a lamp, a coaster, and a framed photo of Claire in kindergarten. She opened the top drawer with care. A brass key sat alone in the corner. The lock below the right cabinet was stiff, resisting like it had forgotten how to be used. She turned the key until it gave a reluctant click. The drawer slid open, and there they were. Folders, envelopes, yellowing legal printouts stacked in careful layers. Margaret ran her fingers across them like she might recognize something by touch alone. She pulled out the top packet, her original will, notarized in 2007, and flipped it open. There it was, Lacey's name, underlined in black ink, circled twice in blue ballpoint pen. Executor, beneficiary. Trusted daughter-in-law. Margaret let out a dry breath, half a laugh, half a wound. She remembered the day Lacey brought soup to her bedside after the gallbladder surgery, sat at her feet like a loyal friend, said things like, "You shouldn't have to worry about bills while you heal. Let me handle it." Then kissed her forehead and walked off with a manila folder Margaret never saw again. She remembered thinking, maybe she just wants to help. Now she knew better. Margaret took a red pen from the cup on her desk and drew a clean X through Lacey's name. Then she opened the next file. The deed, her name alone on the title, always had been. A trust amendment drafted years ago but never finalized. Notes in the margins from her old attorney. A sticky note in her own handwriting that read, "Ask Diane re Clause 3B. Diane." She powered on her laptop, the screen glowing like a small stage as the machine hummed to life. She typed slowly, deliberately, every word a nail in a coffin she no longer feared building. To Diane Mathers. Subject, immediate changes, confidential. Hi Diane, hope you're well. I'm ready to move forward on the revisions we discussed. I'd like to schedule a meeting this week, in person only. Please bring the following: updated trust documents, house deed copy, and options for new executorship and beneficiary designation. Time sensitive, no digital filing until I confirm in writing. Thank you. Margaret Langley. She hit send, then sat back in her chair and stared at the inbox, waiting for that soft whoosh of the outgoing message. When it came, it sounded final. She glanced again at the will, at the clean X over Lacey's name. The ink hadn't even dried yet, but it already felt permanent. Outside, the laughter from downstairs drifted faintly up the vents. Someone turned up the volume on the TV. Someone else, Lacey, giggled. Margaret could almost hear her cutting into a second slice of pie, perfectly unaware. Margaret reached for the desk drawer and pulled out the second envelope. This one was blank, unlabeled. Inside it, she slid her updated healthcare directive and a sticky note that read, "Claire, if you ever need to know why, check the drafts." Then she locked the drawer again. This time, the key stayed in her palm. She didn't return it to its corner. She slid it onto a chain and clasped it around her neck. Downstairs, the world kept pretending she was just waiting to fade. But in this room, with red ink drying and names vanishing one stroke at a time, Margaret was writing herself back in. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter the next morning, pouring hot water over a bag of chamomile, the steam curling toward the ceiling like breath escaping. The house was quiet, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the tap of her spoon against ceramic. Alan walked in, adjusting the cuff of his dress shirt, distracted. He glanced at her but didn't really see her. "You need anything from the pharmacy today?" She stirred her tea once more. "No, thank you. I won't be here this morning. Got some errands." Alan blinked. "Oh?" Before he could ask more, Lacey breezed in, barefoot, scrolling her phone. "Try not to forget where you're going," she muttered, not even looking up. Margaret sipped her tea. "I have a clear destination." That made Lacey glance up briefly, eyebrow raised. But Margaret had already turned toward the hallway, calm and unreadable. She left 15 minutes later, dressed in slate-gray slacks, a deep plum sweater, and the gold locket Claire had once given her for Mother's Day. The key from her desk now hung discreetly beneath it, cool against her skin. Diane's law office was located downtown, tucked between a florist and an antique store that hadn't opened on time in 20 years. The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner and crisp paper. Margaret declined the offer of coffee and sat quietly, hands folded until Diane appeared. "Margaret," she said warmly. "Right on time." They stepped into a small, windowed conference room with a single orchid blooming in a pot. Diane, always brisk but kind, opened a leather folder and pulled out a slim packet of papers. "These are your current options," she said, laying out 3 distinct forms. "We can revise the trust to exclude your current beneficiary, reassign deed ownership, or place it in a private trust, and we'll need to update your healthcare proxy and executorship." Margaret took her time reading, not because she didn't understand, but because she wanted to feel each change in her hands before it was made real. She paused, at her own name at the top of each form. Her handwriting already existed in parts of the original drafts, notes from younger years, marginalia from before Richard passed. She pointed to one line. "This makes Claire my healthcare proxy?" Diane nodded. "Yes, you'll need to initial here and here." "And Lacey is removed from everything?" "Entirely, legally and permanently." Margaret picked up the pen. It didn't shake. She signed the documents one by one, the pen whispering across the pages with the finality of wind sealing a door. When she finished, she pushed the stack toward Diane. "Keep everything off digital record until it's finalized. I don't want notifications. I don't want alerts." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Diane nodded, slipping the forms into a secure sleeve. "We'll file hard copies and store backups in the firm vault. No emails, no cloud. This doesn't exist online until you say it does." Margaret stood and adjusted her bag. "Good." As Diane walked her out, she paused just before the door. "For what it's worth," the lawyer said, "you're not the first client I've seen make this kind of change. But you're the only one who looks like she's finally breathing doing it." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's because I am." Outside, the sky had shifted from gray to gold. A breeze lifted the hem of her sweater as she walked back to her car, each step firmer than the one before. By the time she returned home, the dishwasher was running, Lacey's voice chirping somewhere upstairs on a call, Alan humming out of tune. Nobody asked where she'd been. But that night, as Margaret climbed into bed, the folder of signed documents resting in her locked drawer, she whispered to herself, not out loud, but somewhere deep in her chest, "I am no one's afterthought." And just as her eyes closed, her phone lit up with a new email. Subject: Offer received. Confidential. The smell of roasted garlic and rosemary wafted down the hallway like a taunt. Margaret stood at the threshold of the kitchen, hands folded loosely in front of her apron, watching Lacey buzz between the stove and the sink like the crown jewel of some Food Network fantasy. Her voice was loud, performative, and matched the curated playlist pulsing softly from the Bluetooth speaker tucked behind a bowl of fruit. Alan was uncorking wine with more effort than finesse, grunting as the cork gave way with a pop. "5 bottles should be enough, right?" "For 8 adults?" Lacey said with a wink. "Barely." Margaret opened her mouth just slightly, then closed it again. The table had been extended, 2 leaves added, and Margaret's antique linens dressed it like a stranger in borrowed clothes. Her china, her crystal water goblets, even the serving spoons with the faded engravings from her wedding registry were laid out as if she had died last Tuesday. "Mom?" Alan finally noticed her. "You're still up?" Lacey turned. "Oh, you don't have to worry about tonight, Margaret. Just relax in your room. I've got it covered." "I live here," Margaret said softly. Lacey was already pivoting back toward the oven. "Exactly, which means you get the privilege of skipping the cleanup." Margaret didn't argue. She simply turned and walked back to her room, each step measured like she was pacing herself through something surgical. An hour later, the front door opened and closed on a rotating cast of laughter, perfume, and boots, tracking in flecks of gold-red leaves. Margaret sat in her room, door slightly ajar, a book open but unread in her lap. She heard the toast, Alan fumbling his way through a story about family resilience. She heard the clatter of forks, the scrape of chairs, the rinse of wine poured too fast, then a voice, sharp, amused, cut through it all. "She's still here?" someone asked, laughing. "I thought the will was set already." More laughter. Someone choked on wine. A woman said, "Oh my God, Lacey, you're terrible." Lacey didn't deny it. Alan chimed in, voice muffled. "It's just venting. She's not dead. Yet." Margaret blinked slowly, her jaw rigid. She reached for the cedar desk's side cabinet and opened it. From the back of the shelf, she pulled a manila folder with the firm's embossed name stamped in the corner. She flipped through the copies. Trust, deed, proxy authorization, all of it sealed and initialed. Everything done except the final delivery. She took out a new folder. This one was navy blue. She labeled it in pen with neat block letters. Final copy. Private. Then she tucked the papers inside. Just as she closed the cabinet, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A photo from Claire. A blurry snapshot of her high school art project. A sculpture of a tree trunk split open to reveal a tiny porcelain heart. Caption, "Got an A. You always told me roots could crack concrete." Margaret smiled. Not bitterly, not even sadly. Just softly. She pulled out a single sheet of stationery, the kind she kept for condolence notes, and began writing. "Dear Claire, sometimes the people who call themselves a family think they get to define what that word means. But I've learned that silence, cruelty, and disregard aren't loyalty just because they're wrapped in tradition. I want you to know I see you. I always have. And when the dust settles, when people realize they can't keep feeding off what they never built, I hope you'll still visit. I hope you'll sit and eat something warm and unhurried. And I hope you'll understand why I did what I'm about to do. Because legacies aren't passed down. They're protected. Love." Grandma Margaret folded the letter and slid it into an envelope addressed by hand. She tucked it beneath her jewelry box, beneath the last sapphire ring she owned that hadn't already been borrowed and never returned. Down the hall, laughter erupted again, but this time, Margaret didn't wince. She crossed the room, pulled open the window an inch, and let the night air sweep in. Cold, clean, honest, and beneath the sound of glasses clinking and shallow voices performing, she whispered to no one, "They're not ready for the next guest list." Then she reached for the bedside lamp and clicked it off. The realtor's pen paused mid-scribble. "Just to confirm," she said, looking up over tortoiseshell frames, "you want a private listing? No signage, no MLS posting, no showings without direct approval?" Margaret nodded once. The deed sat on the conference table between them, crisp and current, her name listed solely and unequivocally. She'd brought every supporting document in a neat leather folio, copies of the trust, tax assessments, even the original title transfer from when she and Richard bought the place in 1986. She didn't want questions. She wanted movement. "I want discretion," she said. "This house is not available to the public. It's available to the right person who knows how to listen." The realtor, a trim woman named Erin with short silver hair and a voice like smoothed gravel, studied her for a moment longer. Then she nodded. "Respectfully, most people in situations like yours don't make the first move. I'm not most people." "No," Erin said with a small smile. "You're not." Margaret handed her the signed client agreement. No open houses, no flyers, no family notice, just quiet offers. Private eyes only. "Understood." As Margaret walked back to the car, her breath visible in the cold morning air, she thought about the sound Lacey made when she laughed too hard at someone else's expense. The open-mouthed, head-thrown-back kind of laugh that didn't invite you in, it shut you out. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. Step 1. Contact buyer's list via Erin. Step 2. Prepare inventory list of what's mine. Step 3. Pack the memory box. Step 4. Close without witnesses. At dinner that night, Margaret served pot roast and garlic rolls. She'd cooked it herself, even though Lacey usually insisted on handling weeknight meals to keep things organized. But tonight, Lacey had been out all afternoon getting her hair done and came home to a full table, warm plates, and a bottle of red already breathing. "Wow," Lacey said, sliding into her chair. "What's the occasion?" No occasion, Margaret said, ladling potatoes onto Tyler's plate. Just felt like a good day. You're oddly cheerful, Lacey said, eyeing her. Someone get a clean bill of health? Margaret smiled, folding her napkin across her lap. Some things are just finally coming together. Alan grunted in agreement, too focused on his phone to catch the undercurrent. Claire looked up from across the table and met Margaret's eyes for a beat. She said nothing, but a small smile twitched at the corner of her mouth. The next morning, Erin called. "I've got someone," she said. "Private investor, local. Doesn't need financing, just due diligence. Want something with bones, character, something loved." Margaret pressed the phone closer to her ear. "And quiet?" "Discretion is built into her offer. She's a hospice nurse, said she knows how to enter and exit without disrupting lives." Margaret didn't laugh, but the corners of her mouth lifted. "What's the offer?" 15 over market. Cash ready. No contingencies. She saw the exterior photos, asked about the garden, and said she'd take it as is. Her only question was, "Does it feel like a home?" Margaret looked toward the hallway outside her room, the one that used to echo with laughter that reached her door. Now it just echoed. "Not anymore," she said softly. "Tell her I'm interested. Would you like to schedule a walkthrough?" "Not yet. Let me give you a date." Margaret ended the call, locked her phone, and reached for the blue folder in her drawer. She slid a fresh printed sheet inside, the offer confirmation and buyer profile. Then she added a new sticky note beside Claire's letter. "This is what they don't see coming." Downstairs, the dishwasher beeped. A fork clinked in the sink. Margaret walked into her closet and pulled down a suitcase she hadn't touched in 3 years. The zipper groaned. Open like it, too, had been waiting for its chance. This wasn't a backup plan. This was the beginning of the exit, and the front door still had her key. The final papers were delivered in a thin, white envelope, a single tab sealed with a strip of tape, and something that felt dangerously close to peace. Margaret sat at the dining room table with the sunlight slanting in across the hardwood, lighting up the legal packet like it was holy text. The official offer had come in just shy of 24 hours after her phone call with Erin. 15% above market, cash on hand, no contingencies, closing possible in 21 days. The house, her house, could be gone before the first string of Christmas lights went up. She held the pen for a moment, then signed with a steady hand. It wasn't a rush of triumph, not a vindictive swell. It was relief, like finally untying a dress that hadn't fit for years, but she'd worn anyway out of habit and pressure. The envelope was sealed, scanned, and returned to Erin with a simple message, "Proceed." Then, with the light still strong through the window, Margaret opened her laptop and searched for a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Judith A. RN. Hospice care. State license, retired. The photo on the website showed Judith in her 60s now, still sharp-eyed, holding the hand of a man much older than she was. Margaret remembered that hand. It had once been hers. She clicked the Contact tab and typed, "You once told me that helping people leave with dignity was your calling. Today I get to leave something behind with dignity of my own. Please accept this enclosed donation, quietly, and with the same kindness you gave me when it mattered most. ML." She transferred the funds to the linked nonprofit account Judith had founded after retirement. It wasn't a life-changing amount, but it would buy someone a better bed. A few extra weeks of pain meds, a soft blanket that smelled like lavender and not bleach. That was legacy enough for today. That evening, as she folded laundry in her room, Lacey poked her head through the door. "Hey, you busy this weekend?" Margaret looked up slowly. "Why?" "Alan and I got invited to this couple's spa retreat thing. It's 2 nights. Not far, just outside town. The kids would stay here, obviously. You've done it before." Margaret nodded once. "Of course." Lacey brightened, as if she'd expected resistance. "Great. Their stuff's basically packed already. We'd leave Friday morning, back Sunday night. Thank you, seriously." Margaret smiled. "You're welcome." And meant it. Just not for the reason Lacey thought. After Lacey left, Margaret opened her closet, pulled out the digital camera Richard had once gifted her for memories, and walked the house room by room. She photographed everything, every crack in the plaster, every nick in the hardwood. The upstairs bathroom where the faucet still leaked, the window in Tyler's room with the warped lock. She even snapped a photo of the kitchen cabinet door that squeaked so loud you had to cradle it closed like a newborn. She uploaded every image to an encrypted folder labeled Transfer Readiness. Then she scanned her own records again, will, trust, deed, sale agreement, and uploaded them to a backup drive. A duplicate copy went in the blue folder in her desk, another into a sealed envelope labeled, in case of interference. By the time the kids were in bed and the house had quieted into its usual hum of half-conversations and background TV, Margaret stood at her bedroom window sipping mint tea. She watched Alan and Lacey on the porch, Lacey laughing too loud at something on her phone, Alan texting one-handed. Neither of them looked toward her light. They thought she was folding laundry again. Maybe watching reruns, maybe writing in that old journal she kept beside the bed. But Margaret wasn't recording memories anymore. She was rewriting the ending. She turned off the lamp, her tea warm in her chest. 3 weeks, 21 days, and not one of them knew what was about to leave with her. Not just the house, but the myth of Margaret. And that, finally, was something worth packing. The sound of packing tape echoed like a whisper of finality in the quiet of Margaret's bedroom. Cardboard boxes lined the wall, each one neatly labeled in thick marker. Books to keep. Claire's things. Donation. Sentimental. Sort later. Margaret moved slowly, deliberately. She didn't rush. There was no frenzy, only intention. One drawer at a time, one memory at a time. The weight of old scarves, recipes tucked into yellowed envelopes, letters folded and refolded so many times they creased like skin. The sun hung low in the window, casting stripes across the cedar floorboards. The same boards Alan had learned to crawl on. The same hallway Lacey had once walked down in borrowed heels, laughing too loudly at a joke that hadn't been funny. She slid a small velvet box into the Claire pile. Inside was a silver ring with a garnet set in. The center, her own mother's. It had skipped a generation, Margaret always thought. Lacey would have hawked it or lost it to a manicure tray. Just as she was folding up a stack of linen napkins, Lacey's voice called up the stairs. "Spring cleaning already?" The words rode the tail of a dry chuckle. "Should I be worried you're nesting or dying?" Margaret didn't flinch. She smoothed the tape across a box lid and stood. "I like making space," she said, walking past Lacey's open-mouthed smirk on the landing. "You'd be amazed what clarity comes with it." Downstairs, Margaret brewed herself a fresh pot of tea and took her cup to the sunroom, her favorite corner of the house, where the walls were more glass than drywall and the view gave her silence instead of sarcasm. She opened her phone and tapped Claire's name. The girl picked up on the second ring. "Grandma? Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause. Margaret could hear the shift in Claire's voice, even through the static. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Margaret said. "More than okay. I just wanted to talk." Claire's voice softened. "I'm glad you called." They spoke for nearly an hour. Margaret asked about Claire's college essays, her ceramics project, a book they'd both read months ago but never got to unpack. Claire told her about the night she caught Lacey rummaging through Margaret's jewelry box, looking for something that matched, and how Lacey once told her, straight-faced, "Your grandma forgets things all the time now. It's sad, really." "I knew it was a lie," Claire said. "You don't forget. You just let things go until they don't deserve your energy anymore." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I've been quiet for a long time." "I know. But that's about to change." There was silence on the other end. Not dead air. Just something settling. Then Claire said, "Whatever you need, I'm in." Margaret smiled. "Thank you." After the call, she stood by the window and looked out at the yard. The garden bed was overgrown now, the soil tired, but the camellias had bloomed anyway, even when no one had tended them. She opened her notes app and added a new line. Step 5, leave the camellias, take the rest. From the hallway, she heard Lacey's laughter again, something about Pinterest centerpieces and a Christmas party. Margaret stared out at the sky. If Lacey wanted her gone, she'd be getting her wish. She just wouldn't be getting the house with it. She turned back to her desk, opened the blue folder, and slid in a new sheet, a printed confirmation from the buyer's escrow account. Fully funded. Finalized pending inspection. No mention of family anywhere on the paperwork. Then she reached into the Claire's Things box and placed one more item inside, a Polaroid of the two of them at the town fair, a funnel cake between them, powdered sugar in both their hair. Margaret had written on the back that day, "This is what love that doesn't compete looks like." She sealed the box, and just as she folded back the flaps, her phone lit up again, this time with a calendar notification. Inspection visit. Proposed date. Friday, 9 a.m. She tapped confirm. The house would be hers for just 2 more weekends. And then, like all myths that get mistaken for women, Margaret would vanish on her own terms. The smell of vanilla, cinnamon, and browned butter filled the kitchen like a hymn. Margaret stood at the counter, sleeves rolled above her elbows, pressing cookie dough into perfect circles on a sheet lined with parchment. The sun lit the counters in a warm spill, catching the sugar-dusted flour floating through the air. She hadn't baked like this in years, not since birthdays felt earned, not expected. "Okay, we need chocolate chips here and sprinkles there," she called. Tyler, apron twisted sideways, dumped a full cup of chips onto one lump of dough. Claire, now 17, snorted with laughter and grabbed a spoon to redistribute the mess. Her cheeks were pink from the oven heat and joy. "You've created a chocolate mountain, dude," she teased. "It's a volcano," Tyler corrected proudly. "Chocolate eruption." Margaret chuckled as she slid a tray into the oven. "You two are officially promoted to sous chefs." "Do we get pay?" Claire asked. "No, but you get to eat the rejects." Claire smirked. Sold. It felt like something forgotten but not lost, this warmth, this laughter ricocheting off tile and cupboards. Music hummed low in the background, something vintage and mellow, and Tyler had frosting on his chin and no one corrected him. Claire flicked flour at her grandmother and didn't apologize. Margaret didn't flinch. For a moment, the kitchen belonged to joy, until the back door opened. Lacey's heels clicked in sharp rhythm against the tile. The laughter dipped, not dead, but quieter. Her eyes landed on the scene like a needle on a balloon, uncertain where to press, but threatening. "Oh," she said slowly, "this is festive." Claire straightened, wiping her hands on a towel. "We're baking." "I can see that." Margaret turned calmly. "We're almost done. The kids wanted to decorate." Lacey blinked, then smiled thinly. "Of course. I just didn't realize we were staging a Hallmark movie." From the living room, Alan's voice floated in. "She's not dead yet. Might as well let her have this." It wasn't cruel, not shouted, just careless, but it landed like a slap. Margaret's hand stilled mid-stir. The wooden spoon paused in the bowl. Claire's jaw tensed. But Margaret was already moving again, slow and deliberate. "Claire, love, would you check the timer?" Claire stepped away from the table. Margaret slid the next tray into the oven without a word. Lacey lingered for a beat longer, then left. Her perfume trailed behind like spoiled citrus. The laughter didn't return immediately. But eventually Tyler tried to stack cookies into a leaning tower, and Claire swatted his hand, and the moment healed itself with small, earnest patches. That night, after the kitchen was scrubbed and the air smelled of dish soap and dough instead of dread, Margaret sat at her desk with her journal. She wrote in her own tidy cursive, "I will not let them turn my last days into their joke." She underlined it once, then closed the book. She reached for the blue folder, now growing heavier with every week, and took out the most recent documents: the signed escrow agreement, the home inspection confirmation, the pending deed transfer. And then she opened a new email. To Diane Mathers. Subject: Revised request. Fast track. Hi Diane, let's move the closing to the earliest possible date. If inspection clears Friday, I want everything filed and finalized the following week. Confirm Claire's paperwork as healthcare proxy and primary beneficiary on file. Please expedite. Quietly. ML. She hit send, and for a long while, just sat in the dark, hands folded, the warm after scent of baked sugar still lingering in her sweater. 2 more weeks had just become 1. By the time the cookies were gone, the house wouldn't be hers. But Claire would be. And that, not the porcelain dishes or the deed or the outdated attic, was the real inheritance. Across the hall, Lacey's voice carried through the walls. She was on the phone again, planning the Christmas table settings. Margaret smiled to herself. Let her. By Christmas, there would be no table left to set. The conference room was small, sunlit, and smelled faintly of printer toner and lavender hand lotion. A ficus stood in the corner like an indifferent witness. Margaret sat at the head of the table, hands resting on a thick stack of closing documents, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. Across from her sat the buyer, a woman in her 40s with gentle eyes and a clipboard balanced neatly on her lap. She didn't smile too much, didn't try to make small talk. She simply looked at Margaret and said, "When you're ready." Margaret picked up the pen. There was no tremor in her hand. The signature flowed. First name, last name, the way it had since 1962. Only now, the name meant freedom, not obligation. The buyer leaned forward and added her own signature. A notary stamped the final page with a clean, decisive press. Aaron, the realtor, let out a low breath and slid the final copy into a folder marked "Closed." "Congratulations, Mrs. Langley. The property is officially transferred. I'll forward your copies and wire confirmation within the hour." Margaret gave a small nod. "Thank you." The buyer stood and extended a hand. "You built something with roots," she said. "Now someone else gets to grow something from it." Margaret shook her hand. "Just don't forget to prune." The office was cool as she stepped outside, the late November sun sharp through bare branches. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. That afternoon, she pulled up to a bungalow with cream-colored siding and a porch swing that creaked politely in the breeze. It sat tucked between a church and a library, quiet neighbors, the kind that didn't ask questions. The lease had been signed weeks ago, keys already in her purse, utilities already in her name. Claire was waiting inside, unpacking a box labeled "Essentials, tea plus flashlight." "You made it," she said, setting the kettle on the stove. "I always do." They worked together for an hour, unloading dishes, hanging up 2 framed photos, tucking the jewelry box beneath the bathroom sink. Claire didn't ask about the house. Margaret didn't offer. At sunset, Claire locked the door and slipped back out the back gate, unseen, as planned. 10 minutes away, the old house buzzed with the beginning of another plan. Lacey had 3 Pinterest tabs open, her laptop angled on the island. She held a swatch of plaid ribbon in one hand and waved a spoon with the other. "I'm thinking rustic but chic, burlap but elegant, and we'll do 2 trees, 1 real, 1 artificial, for the foyer photos." Alan sat at the counter, scrolling through his phone, nodding. "Are we footing the whole thing?" Lacey rolled her eyes. "Margaret will. She always..." "It does. She loves a family tradition." From the hallway, Margaret watched them, just stood there silent. They didn't notice. She lingered a moment longer, then walked past the kitchen and into the study, her old refuge. The desk still sat where it always had, though dust had begun to layer the corners. She opened the center drawer. Inside, she placed 1 final envelope, handwritten, heavy. It was addressed simply, "To the family who stayed too long." Then she stood, smoothed her sweater, and took one last look around, not at the furniture or the paint, not at the things, at the echoes. Lacey's laughter, Alan's shrug, the sound of drawers opening to take what was never offered. Margaret walked to the front door and paused with her hand on the knob. Behind her, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon. Ahead of her, the night smelled like cold air and clean starts. She stepped out, and as the door clicked shut behind her, Claire's voice buzzed softly through a text. "All clear. You did it." Margaret didn't reply. She just smiled, because some victories don't need applause, just an exit. And the right envelope left behind. The roast chicken was dry. Margaret chewed it anyway, slowly, methodically, like she had time to spare. She sat at her usual spot, 3rd chair from the end, beneath the dimmed chandelier. The same chair she'd occupied since Alan was in braces and Claire wore barrettes. But tonight, the room felt foreign. Not hostile, just not hers. Plates clinked, forks scraped. Lacey's voice floated above the rest, cutting the air with curated charm. "Margaret's awfully quiet tonight," she said, reaching for the cranberry relish. "Don't worry, she's just waiting around to die. Right, Mom?" A flicker of laughter from across the table. One guest choked slightly on a sip of wine. Alan chuckled, soft but audible. Margaret lifted her tea to her lips, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond. She didn't flinch. Claire, seated 2 spots over, slid her phone out, tapped a message, then reconsidered. Instead, she tore a piece of paper from her notebook and wrote a single line. She passed it carefully under the table, palming it to Margaret like contraband. Margaret unfolded the note under her napkin. "You okay?" She looked up. Claire met her eyes. Steady, clear, old soul, serious. Margaret smiled faintly, then leaned just close enough for Claire to hear. "Watch the mailbox tomorrow." Claire gave the smallest nod. Dessert was served, store-bought pumpkin pie. No one noticed Margaret didn't eat hers. Lacey laughed too hard at a joke Alan barely told. Tyler asked to be excused. Someone spilled cider. Nobody asked Margaret a single question. Not about her day, not about her new space, not even about the weather. She set her fork down gently. The room pulsed around her, wine glass stems chiming, silverware tapping, voices spiraling upward like steam from a pot. Margaret pushed her chair back slowly, the legs squealing against hardwood like a warning no one heeded. She stood. The conversation kept going. She cleared her throat. "Thank you for dinner." Heads turned. Lacey blinked. Margaret smiled softly. "It's been a pleasure." The room paused, not in panic, but confusion, like someone had misread a toast cue. She walked to the hallway, grabbed her coat off the hook, and opened the front door. Cool night air pressed against her cheeks. She didn't look back. Behind her, Claire turned to watch her leave. Her expression was unreadable. Alan, too caught in the story he was telling, barely registered the door closing. The next morning, Lacey hummed in the kitchen while flipping through a glossy holiday catalog. "Should we do plaid napkins or gold-rimmed?" she asked aloud. Alan shrugged. "Plaid's fine." Tyler ran through the hallway, nearly knocking over a side table. Claire sat at the window, quiet, watching the mail truck roll up. The mailbox creaked open. Metal clicked, then closed. Claire stood and walked outside. She returned holding a single manila envelope, no return address. She placed it on the table and stepped back. Alan opened it, frowning at the thickness. He slid out a stack of papers: sale confirmation, deed transfer, new trust paperwork, final signature from Margaret Langley. Attached to the top was a handwritten letter. No greeting, just, "You have 21 days to vacate. This home no longer belongs to you. There will be no extensions. Everything is legal. And final." There was silence. Lacey's hand twitched. Alan read the letter again, slower this time. Claire sat back down, crossed her arms, and stared straight ahead. Outside, the wind picked up. The garden rustled, and somewhere in a bungalow 10 minutes away, Margaret stirred her tea. The porch swing creaked. She didn't smile. Not yet. She was waiting for the sound of the first slammed cabinet, because this time they wouldn't get a warning, only a deadline, and her silence would say the rest. The knock wasn't polite. It rattled the door like a threat. 3 sharp strikes, followed by the sound of Alan's voice just behind it, angry, raw, unrecognizable. "Open the door, Mom!" Margaret didn't rush. She placed her mug, still half full of chamomile, on a coaster, smoothed her cardigan, and walked to the entryway with the calm of a woman expecting the storm she'd invited. She opened the door. Alan stood on the porch, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. Behind him, Lacey hovered, her face blotchy, mascara smudged, the glossy finish stripped from her usual composure. "What is this?" Alan demanded, holding up the manila envelope like it had burned him. Margaret didn't answer. She stepped aside. "If you want to yell, do it somewhere that won't disturb the neighbors." He walked in without permission. Lacey followed, trailing a perfume of panic and entitlement. Margaret gestured toward the dining table. A folder sat neatly at its center. Alan slapped the envelope down beside it. "You blindsided us. You sold the house? Without even telling me? It wasn't yours to be told about, Margaret said, her tone level. Lacey's voice cracked. You tricked us. You lied. Margaret turned her gaze toward her daughter-in-law, eyes steady. Number you assumed. There's a difference. Alan opened the folder. Inside was the original deed from 1986. Margaret Langley, sole owner. No co-signers. No shared title. He flipped to the next page. Trust updates. The notarized proxy appointment. Claire's name printed in elegant font beneath the words, legal beneficiary. He looked up, color draining from his face. You gave it all to her? No, Margaret said. I took it back. There's a difference. Lacey stepped forward, shaking. You let us live there. You let our kids believe it was theirs, that it would be. You let them believe that. Margaret cut in, voice still soft. You. With your snide jokes and your guest lists and your locked doors. I just stopped correcting you. Alan slammed a hand on the table. The folder flinched. You could have told me. We're your family. Were, Margaret said simply. The silence stretched. Then came the sound of a car door outside. Claire entered moments later, calm, composed, a bag of groceries in her arms. She paused at the threshold, seeing the wreckage in the air before it fully hit her. She looked to Margaret. Margaret gave her the smallest nod. Claire crossed the room and stood beside her grandmother. She said nothing. She didn't apologize, she didn't explain, she just stood. Alan's eyes darted between them. So that's it? You're what, going to ride off into the sunset and leave us homeless? No, Margaret said. You have 20 days. That's more than I was ever given. Lacey's voice broke. This is revenge. Margaret tilted her head. This is boundaries. You never notice the difference. Alan gritted his teeth. We'll fight it. Margaret stepped closer, slow and deliberate. She reached into a drawer and pulled out another folder, stamped, signed, sealed. She handed it to Alan like a doctor passing a diagnosis. Try, she said. Everything's legal and notarized. He stared at her, at the signatures, the seal, the date stamps, his own name absent from all of it. Lacey sat down heavily in a chair, breath hitching. We built our life in that house, she whispered. Margaret's expression didn't change. On someone else's foundation. Alan looked at Claire. You knew? Claire nodded. You're just letting this happen? I'm helping it happen, Claire said, because I actually asked what Grandma wanted, and I listened. Alan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Margaret turned to her son one last time. You thought I'd stay silent until the end, but I've decided not to go quietly. She walked to the door and held it open. Alan looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. Then he left. Lacey followed, silent, shaking. The door clicked closed behind them. Margaret locked it. Claire exhaled, and Margaret said, We're almost done now. Just one piece left. Claire looked at her. What's that? Margaret smiled faintly. The goodbye. The first excuse arrived in the form of a story. Tyler, 9 years old and already learning how to navigate the shape of silence in a house filled with tension, repeated it at the dinner table 2 nights after the envelope. Mom said Grandma's leaving us because we stressed her out too much, he announced between bites of reheated mac and cheese, that she wants to be alone, forever. Claire looked up from her plate. Lacey, standing at the sink, didn't flinch. It's true, some people just don't have it in them to be part of a family anymore. Alan grunted. She always liked drama. Claire pushed her plate away. You two never really noticed how much you took from her, did you? Alan glanced at her. Excuse me? Claire stood, her tone even. She's not abandoning us. She's protecting herself. Big difference. Lacey let out a dry laugh. You're too young to understand how this works. No, Claire said. I'm just not old enough to pretend I don't. She turned to Tyler and knelt beside his chair. Grandma didn't leave you. She left a house where people treated her like she didn't matter. She still loves you. Tyler frowned. But why can't we visit her? You can. Any time, Claire said. You just have to ask, and not believe everything you're told when adults are angry. Later that week, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watering the tiny basil plant Claire had brought over last Sunday. The leaves had doubled in size. Her phone buzzed. A text preview from the bungalow's security camera app. Front door, motion detected. 2:14 p.m. She opened the app and saw Lacey, standing there in a cream blouse, lips glossed to perfection, holding a bouquet of lilies. Fake smile. Real desperation. Margaret didn't move. She watched from the kitchen as the knock echoed through her phone speaker. Lacey's head tilted toward the peephole, all practiced vulnerability and performative charm. "Margaret? I just wanted to talk. I brought you something." She waited, knocked again, waited. Eventually, the screen showed her turning back toward her car, deflating step by step. Margaret placed the watering can on the counter and resumed pinching the dead leaves from the basil. A few hours later, Diane's name appeared in her inbox. Forwarded message, from Alan Langley, to Diane Mathers, Esq. Subject, house transfer. Any path to amend? Message, Diane, I was hoping you could advise if there's any pathway to review or amend the recent trust updates. It's been disruptive for our family and was clearly a surprise. Please advise. Alan attached PDF copies of the trust and will, annotated in red. Beneath it, Diane had written only one sentence, your call. Margaret stared at the email for a long moment, then opened a fresh reply window. To Diane Mathers. Subject, Alan Langley inquiry. Let the clock run out, thank you, ML. She clicked send. That night, Claire came over again. No groceries, no errands, just presents. They drank herbal tea and played a quiet round of gin rummy while Claire updated her grandmother on the kids' school projects, how Tyler had decided to write his book report on Charlotte's Web because it made people cry in a good way. Margaret smiled. I like that boy's instincts, she said. Claire laughed softly. He gets them from you. Before she left, Claire placed her hand over Margaret's. If they keep pushing the kids into the middle of this, let me handle it, please. Margaret nodded once. I'm not here to punish, she said, just to preserve. Claire kissed her cheek and left. Margaret locked the door behind her and sat alone in the dim room, the folder still thick in her desk drawer, the basil still thriving under its grow light. Outside, the wind picked up again. Inside, the deadline ticked closer. They had 15 days left, and no more excuses that would change a thing. The sun was just high enough to throw long slants of light through the old bay window when the doorbell rang. Margaret stood already waiting, cardigan folded neatly over her arm, the air inside her bungalow quiet, except for the ticking of the clock above the mantel. She opened the door before the second chime. Erin stood on the porch, clipboard tucked under one arm. Her realtor's smile dialed down to respectful. Beside her stood a young couple, mid-30s maybe, dressed in winter layers and quiet anticipation. The woman held a baby strapped to her chest in a soft wrap, its tiny fists balled at its sides. Margaret, Erin said with a nod. This is Harper and Nate Lawson. The couple each offered a hand. Margaret shook both. Thank you for letting us see it again, Harper said, voice low. We just needed to stand in it one more time before signing. It's your future home now, Margaret said gently. You have every right. The group stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and lavender sachets. The kitchen had been staged to reflect warmth without sentiment, Margaret's doing. Fresh tea towels, a loaf of bread cooling on the stove, 3 clean mugs stacked neatly beside a note card propped on the counter. Welcome. Take your time. This house knows how to listen. The couple moved slowly through the rooms, their footsteps hushed. Nate ran his fingers along the doorframe of the den, pausing at the built-in bookshelves. Harper lingered in the sunroom, rocking slightly on her heels as the baby yawned against her chest. We love the warmth in this house, Harper whispered. Margaret nodded, arms folded loosely. It's been lived in, but not loved in a while. A long silence stretched. Honest, full of the kind of reverence that couldn't be faked. From the sidewalk outside, behind the hedges, a pale figure stood still. Lacey. Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the glass door, arms crossed, hair half-tamed, her expression stretched tight with disbelief, watching, just watching. Inside, Erin tapped her watch softly. "They're good," she said to Margaret. "They'll sign. All we need is your final date." Margaret took out her phone. An incoming call buzzed across the screen. "Alan." She let it ring, then tapped silence, and with a calm swipe of her finger, she opened her calendar, scrolled to the earliest allowable close, and tapped the date, 7 days from today. Erin's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I'll get the paperwork filed before sundown." Margaret nodded. "Make sure they have the new deed by Monday." In the kitchen, Claire appeared quietly, holding a small card printed in gold script. She placed it on the counter beneath the welcome note. It read, "Coming soon, new beginnings." Harper saw it and smiled. Outside, Lacey turned and walked away, her heels clicking unevenly across the driveway, her posture stiffer than usual. Less steel, more shell. Back in the kitchen, Claire poured herself a glass of water and looked around the house she'd spent her summers in. "It feels different already," she said softly. "It is," Margaret said. "It finally belongs to someone who wants to build, not just benefit." Harper and Nate returned to the kitchen, the baby now asleep. "We're ready," Nate said. "This feels like home." Margaret handed them a small folder. No fanfare, no bows. "Then treat it like one." They thanked her. Erin confirmed the file submission. Claire held the front door open. Margaret watched them step onto the porch, watched the baby's hand twitch in a dream. Then she looked to Erin. No forwarding address for the current tenants. Let the deadline speak for itself. Erin gave a quiet nod. As the door closed behind them, Margaret took one last walk through the house. Her house, for just 7 more days. She passed the fireplace, the staircase, the faded dent in the wall where Alan had once dropped his backpack too hard. She stopped at the threshold to the study, then turned back toward the front door. 7 days. And only one more weekend for them to pretend they still belonged here. Margaret opened the blue folder in her hands, slid the new closing date confirmation inside, and whispered to herself, "They won't see this until it's already gone." The kitchen sounded like a tantrum. Pots clanged into cardboard, glass clinked against glass with no padding, and the drawer of mismatched utensils screeched as Lacey yanked it open like it owed her something. "Just throw it in," she snapped, jamming a whisk beside a pie server. "We'll sort it later." Alan slammed the pantry door shut behind her. "There won't be a later. She gave us 1 damn weekend." Upstairs, the grandkids hovered in the hallway, watching the chaos spill into every room they once knew as home. "Why are we packing?" Tyler asked, hugging his stuffed lizard tight to his chest. "Isn't this our house?" Claire crouched down beside him, brushing a bit of dust from his sleeve. "It was your house because she let it be, but letting someone borrow something doesn't mean they get to keep it." "But Grandma lived here, you lived here," he said, looking toward the staircase. Claire nodded. "That's true. But people don't stay where they're not respected. Even grown-ups get hurt." He frowned, not quite understanding but close enough to feel it. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he whispered. "I know you didn't." Claire stood and guided him toward his room. "Go pack what's important, just the things that feel like yours, okay?" Downstairs, Alan cursed under his breath as a stack of serving trays refused to fit into a box. Lacey stood in the middle of the dining room, cradling a chipped ceramic platter in both hands, the one Margaret used every Thanksgiving. She didn't wrap it. She just set it in a box, no paper, no care. When the door opened quietly behind her, no one noticed at first. Margaret stepped in, coat buttoned, scarf neatly knotted at her collar. She stood just inside the foyer, looking around like someone taking attendance. The carpet had already been rolled. Boxes were stacked beneath the stairs. The scent of lemon cleaner couldn't quite erase the bitterness in the air. Alan turned, startled. "What are you doing here?" Margaret didn't answer him. She looked at the room, the walls that had heard every careless joke, every eye roll, every moment they mistook her silence for weakness. She stepped toward the fireplace. Lacey looked up, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You're tearing this family apart," she said, voice cracking with a tremble that might have been grief or guilt. "You're punishing all of us." Margaret turned to her, eyes steady. "Number, I'm refusing to carry you any further." She placed a small cream-colored envelope on the mantel. It was addressed in thick, cursive ink, to Claire, Tyler, and Eva, when you're ready to understand. No one reached for it. Margaret gave the room one final scan. The dining table was gone. The shelves were bare. Only the echo of resentment remained. Alan stared at her, fists clenched. "We gave everything to this place." "No," Margaret replied. "You took everything from it, and you assumed I'd never notice." She turned to Claire, who had just returned from upstairs, eyes flicking between her mother's silence and her father's fury. Claire crossed the room and stood by her grandmother's side like she had weeks ago, quiet, steady. "You ready?" Margaret asked. Claire nodded. They stepped into the open doorway together. Margaret paused once on the threshold, letting the cold air bite the moment clean. Behind her, the house sounded suddenly hollow. Outside, the wind tugged softly at the last few leaves on the maple tree. As she reached the sidewalk, Margaret looked up. 7 days were now down to 1, and tomorrow someone else would unlock that door, someone who hadn't laughed at her grief, or mistaken her silence for surrender. The moving trucks rumbled down the street like reluctant elephants, their engines low, tires hissing against the curb as they rolled past Margaret's bungalow. One stopped briefly in front of the old house, just long enough for the last box to be loaded, before easing forward and turning the corner, out of sight, out of their lives. Across the street, fresh paint cans sat on the porch of the house that used to be Margaret's, pale yellow with white trim, soft and clean, like a deep breath held after years of shallow ones. A wreath made of wild eucalyptus leaned against the doorframe. Someone had already hung a brass key hook inside the foyer. She could see it through the window. Harper stepped out first, baby in one arm, a bouquet of sunflowers in the other. Nate followed, carrying a tray of ceramic mugs. They paused together on the porch, taking it all in. Not just the house, but the stillness, the weight of something freshly theirs. From across the street, Margaret watched with a warm mug balanced in her hands. Chamomile again. No sugar. No need. Claire came out of the bungalow a moment later, coat zipped high, manila folder pressed tight against her chest. She took the steps slowly and sat beside her grandmother on the porch swing, the cushions creaking in familiar rhythm. "It's done," she said, handing the folder over. Margaret took it without urgency. The tab read, "Signed, sealed, done." Inside were the last forms. Deed transfer, confirmation of closing funds, and a brief note from Aaron that simply read, "Congratulations, it's all yours, because you let it go." Claire leaned back. "They've already started painting the nursery." Margaret sipped her tea. "Good." Silence settled between them. A comforting kind, the kind that didn't demand filling. They watched as Harper carried a framed photo inside, and Nate set a small potted fern on the window ledge where Margaret's lace curtains once hung. A vibration buzzed from the table beside them. Margaret glanced at the screen. Alan, mobile. Sorry, no punctuation, no explanation. She deleted it without reading further. No hesitation, no anger, just done. Claire didn't ask about the message. Instead, she tilted her head toward the house. "Do you miss it?" Margaret traced her thumb along the edge of her mug. "I miss who I used to be in it, before I let them shrink me, before I let silence replace presence." Claire nodded slowly. "But," Margaret added, her voice steadier now, "I'm proud of who I became outside it." Across the street, laughter echoed through an open window. Harper's, Nate's, the baby cooing in soft reply. Margaret smiled, not at the sound, but at what it meant. The house had found breath again, not recycled air, not choreographed joy, but life. She stood, joints aching but not hurting, and walked to the edge of the porch. The wind tugged gently at her scarf, just enough to remind her that the season was turning. Claire followed, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "What now?" Margaret turned toward her. "Now we plant things." Claire blinked. "You mean like a garden?" "No," Margaret said, eyes sparkling. "I mean roots, just not the kind people think they're owed." They stood together for another minute, watching as the new family disappeared inside. Margaret closed her eyes. The swing behind her creaked once in the wind. Laughter floated from across the street, light, full, untouched by bitterness. And with the sun warm against her cheeks and the last page finally turned, Margaret said softly, "Now it feels like home, even from here."